Good morning and welcome to Trending Treasury, the weekly webcast series run by Arling Close. Throughout the month of August, we're going to be running shortened webcasts. This is the third of four. Before in September, we go back to our slightly longer 30-minute webcast. I do anticipate that today's may be slightly longer than 15 minutes as we have quite a lot to get through, and it's topical. It's on the revised HM Treasury PWLB guidance. Please leave any questions you have in the Q&A box. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Marshom. I'm a senior client executive here at Arling Close, and I'm sure you all know Nick Keeling, who's a client director at Arling Close. He's been on many of these webcasts. How are you, Nick?
Yeah, morning, Perry. I'm well, thanks. Another dull day in North London. I don't know if anyone's had a summer yet, but we're still waiting. Still waiting here.
I second that. Also living in North London, we haven't had many days, maybe one or two. And I'm in the office today, so even in the city of London, I can confirm there's no summer here either. But anyway, cracking on with today's webcast. So what better place to start than asking why has HM Treasury revised its PWLB guidance?
Yeah, it's a good question to start on, really. I mean, we've been involved, since the guidance was released the first time back in November last year. We've been involved with many clients trying to move them through kind of the minefield of is this allowable capital expenditure, or does it fall foul of the new guidance? And the HM Treasury always produced the guidance in such a way that left it open for decisions, left it open for the Section 151 to make that professional judgment as to whether something met the guidance or not. So, however, given that every capital project is different, and even similar capital projects have different themes behind them or different reasons for doing them, the guidance, I think, was a little bit too wide. And with a little bit too little detail, and so the new guidance is a way to try and clarify some issues around the edges to some extent, particularly around when does the guidance come into force, but also what is allowable and what isn't. So there's more examples at the end, for instance. So I'm sure we'll touch upon those later.
Okay, thanks. So if we jump into what's actually changed, and has there been any change or clarifications in the definitions of what would count as regeneration or preventative action?
Not really regen. Regen's been broadly left alone, and I think to some extent that the regen definition was always good enough to determine whether that was the right category or not. Preventative action, I mean, the main clarification there is preventative action is all about preserving existing activity. So it's not about investing in new activity. Essentially, that's not prevention, is it, or preventative action? I suppose that's you could term that as regen. So that's the main thing. The same things apply. So with regen, is it market failure? Are you doing something that the private sector won't do, or are you investing significantly into any asset or building a new asset? And on preventative action, it's all about again, is this something that won't happen without local authority intervention, and is it worth doing? Is it worth saving in many cases? And particularly for preventative action, is there an exit plan? I think that's a key one there. So not a lot has changed there, just some more small clarification.
Okay, so one place where they have expanded the definition in the revised guidance is of an investment asset bought primarily for yield, and this was to capture a capital or property asset or interest or right that generates a balance sheet asset. But what does this actually mean?
Yeah, again, another good question. I suppose you could get round the guidance in some way by loaning money or buying equities or something like that, something that counts as capital expenditure to another organisation or to an organisation you own, really, to carry out that expenditure on your behalf, and yet the local authority still benefits in a way that the Treasury really isn't happy with. So I think it's a way to try and bring that kind of activity into what is primarily for yield. So those kind of more speculative more speculative activity that the PWLB wouldn't like if you were doing it yourself. You can't really get around it by enabling another organisation to do it for you. So yeah, I mean that's it really. It's widening that definition to capture more activity.
Okay, so would there be any situations where an authority has investment assets bought primarily for yield, but they could still access the PWLB under the revised guidance?
Yeah, I mean actually that I probably should have picked that up in the intro. That's probably one of the main clarifications, which will help many clients, I think, or at least those who are still who undertook activity that's primarily for yield before the new guidance came in, and it's carried on through that period, so they committed to it beforehand, or indeed want to refinance but also want to carry on that kind of activity, that primarily for yield activity as well. So there's two aspects to this. One is the clarification, which was always a bit cloudy, really. It wasn't particularly clear. The clarification that if you've entered into purchasing or activity primarily for yield that the PWLB doesn't allow or doesn't lend for, but it was before the 26th of November, and you can evidence the fact that you were committed to it before the 26th of November, but that expenditure has moved forward into later years, then the PWLB will still lend to you. Okay, even though you're carrying out stuff now, which if you planned it and approved it now would not allow you access because it was committed to before the new guidance came in. That is actually allowable now. So that was an important clarification. It always seemed a bit unfair, especially with COVID. It might not have been a big an issue without COVID, but of course when COVID first hit, particularly with the first lockdowns, it put a lot of capital expenditure on hold. I should say a lot of capital projects on hold. So activity that may well have been finished before the rules came in actually has carried on into these later years, or I should say, or was finished in the first year of the rules. So I think that's an important clarification and useful. I know myself, I have a few clients where that's actually happened, and it just wasn't clear enough. So that's a really useful clarification. The other clarification here is, again, the rather unclear situation around refinancing. It seemed in the initial guidance it was allowable, but it wasn't clear how it was allowable because the forms and there didn't seem to be a process for allowing refinancing either of existing debt that was maturing or externalizing internal borrowing if you were locked out of the PWLB because you were carrying out investments primarily for yield. The PWLB always said that was possible, but it wasn't certain how that was possible. Well, they've clarified this, that it is allowable. So you have to make a note of this on the application forms and the documents, but it is allowable. So it's something they will allow going forward. So it's just clearer. And so for clients that are kind of caught in, well, we need to do something, we know it's not allowable, but we also want to externalize, it just means it's easier for them to actually carry out that new borrowing now. The proviso, of course, is that you can't refinance any spending on investments primarily for yield. So you can't go out and say in year one of your capital program, you can't go out and spend 25 million, say, on investment primarily for yield that don't meet the PWLB criteria. Finance it by, I don't know, short-term LA to LA loans, and then it comes through into next year when you've got access to new borrowing and you can refinance that from the PWLB. That's not allowable. So they've made that very clear. Yes, we will allow you to refinance or to externalize internal borrowing within that year that you're locked out, but you cannot refinance borrowing that is linked to investments primarily for yield.
Okay, thanks. So that's quite a key change, or should I say clarification in the latest revision to the guidance. So just on Treasury Management, which has now been included in the guidance, what has HM Treasury said about local authorities using the PWLB for Treasury Management purposes?
Yeah, well, I think we've just covered that really.
Yeah.
In terms of, that for them, Treasury Management is all about refinancing. So it is that refinancing of maturing borrowing. it is that refinancing of existing internal borrowing, so externalizing internal borrowing. So that is now easier to do, whether you're, well, it doesn't matter if you've got access to PWLB, whether you're locked out of the PWLB or not. So definitely, those clarifications really do help. I think, there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and also some of the feedback we got from local authorities trying that. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to get the message across the Treasury. So hopefully they're more aware of it at the PWLB and at HM Treasury, and the forms, the way local authorities can then apply for new borrowing where they're in that position, will be easier for them now as well going forward.
Okay, good. So it's a topic that's not spoken about too often, but it's one of sanctions. So what type of sanctions can be imposed if transactions are deemed to be an inappropriate use of PWLB loans?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of this in the guidance, actually. I'm not sure many people get down to that point. They kind of stop at the categorizing, the type of borrowing activity or the capital investment activity. But the sanctions is a large part of the guidance. So there's a few. The guidance focuses on, before you've done the transaction, the capital transaction, or after you've done the transaction, or indeed after so this is when the loan's being made from the PWLB, or indeed the sanctions after the loan has actually been made and it's then revisited, perhaps because the auditors have picked something up or the Treasury have picked something up themselves. Well, what's interesting to me is that, so if they haven't lent, so it's it's before lending and it's a planned transaction, so it's something that happened in the future, then they could ask you to scrap the project, so take it out of your capital program. So essentially saying you won't have access to the PWLB unless you do something about this project, because we don't think this project meets, which is what you'd expect, really. That's the whole point. They're just implementing the rules there. What they can do as well is review the rest of the program and focusing on contentious projects. So you're inviting essentially the Treasury to have a closer eye on what you're doing, and it may be that there's more changes to your capital program that may be necessary there. If it's after the transaction, so you've already, say, bought the building that's kind of now in dispute, the borrowing for that's now in dispute, so they can review your program. What's interesting here is they could charge you a higher interest rate on the loan. Okay, so yes, we've done what we've done. We've applied for borrowing. They might still lend you the money, but it might be at a higher interest rate. We don't know what that will be. So how high will that penalty rate be? Or they could actually ask you to unwind the transaction within a reasonable time frame. And by unwinding the transaction, I mean getting rid of the offending assets, or whatever you're doing. So that's interesting. So after the loan's been made, so that they've lent it, and then 6 months later they've revisited it, or the auditors revisited it. Two things here. So the same two things apply. They could then charge a higher rate on your loan. So you're not scot-free, essentially. That they can revisit the terms in which they've lent to you. They could ask you to unwind a transaction, and perhaps more damagingly, they could request full repayment of the loan. Now that is under the repayment terms, and of course everyone listening will know that you're borrowing at a margin of about 100 basis points over the repayment rates, so that could be quite costly. So these are all actions they can take. One thing that's in the guidance, I mean, they do say if they review it after the event and they find that the information provided is materially incorrect or misleading, so it makes it, again, the onus is on the judgment of the Section 151, the professional judgment of the Section 151. So it really, you really need to be honest, I suppose. It is, don't be misleading in your return, and get your facts correct, because those are clearly going to be the criteria. If there's a difference of judgment, well, and you're convinced for whatever reason that actually this is allowable, and the Treasury is saying, well, I don't think it's allowable, but it's an honest difference of opinion. It may be, we don't know, but it may be that the sanctions may be less severe than if you've literally lied on your form. and it's clear, you've said it's regen, it clearly isn't. You can see the Treasury taking more severe action in that case. So it just, I think that's what it's trying to get across in that point.
Okay, I can see questions that have been put in. So thank you to everyone that's put questions in the live Q&A box. If you have any, please put them in there, and we will answer them towards the end of the webcast. But there hasn't just been a change or revision to PWLB guidance, has there? There's also been a change to the PWLB terms and conditions. Arlene Close has released an update on this and the revised guidance. So if you haven't read that yet, I would encourage you to do so. So we're in terms of terms and conditions, what are the main changes, Nick, and when will they take effect?
Yeah, okay, so the take effect date is the 8th of September, I believe. So not too far away, a few weeks away. The main change, I think, from my point of view, is that the settlement time, which was always a real benefit of the PWLB, frankly, T+2 previously. So you could use it. You weren't supposed to use it as a liquidity facility, but it could be there, and it wasn't great value to use it in that regard. But very quick, borrowing decisions. The decision from yes, we'll borrow to we're actually receiving the money was a very quick turnaround, which was fantastic. It's not changing materially, but it is changing. It is extending. So now it'll be T+5, which you might say actually given how quick it is perhaps to reach to get through to the PWLB and actually say yes, we want the money in for them to approve it, it's still much shorter than other ways of sourcing finance, with the exception perhaps of LA to LA short-term loans. So clients just need to be aware of that. If you need money in 2 days' time and it's past the 8th of September, you'll have to short-term finance in the meantime, because obviously it's now a 5-day wait. There are a couple of other things, maybe less important perhaps. Minimum rates on PWLB will be 0.01%. So PWLB rates will never go negative, essentially. I think we put in the update, which was a good point. Given the margin's 80 basis points, rates would need to go very heavily negative, for you to be losing out. Essentially, need to go down past minus 0.79%. So highly unlikely, but just so people are aware of that. Another thing is, I think was quite interesting, was clarification around when do you need to change your delta returns. So I mean, maybe this is more linked to the guidance, but so what they've said is that the delta returns will open on the 1st of March in advance for the next financial year and close on the 31st of March of that financial year, of the second financial year. Sorry. And if there are any material changes to the delta fund, they need to be made, and they've classed materials either changes to the funding strategy, or changes to the capital expenditure side, so the actual capital spending of over 10%. So I think that's a useful clarification as well. So you can actually go in and actually change your delta format, given those clarifications.
Okay, thanks for that, Nick. I think now's a good time to jump to the questions, and we have one from Lewis at Spellthorne, so thank you very much for that. And he asks, can you externalize internal borrowing on property investment?
Okay, I think you mean here, can you borrow from the PWLB to externalize internal borrowing and then use essentially your reserves, I guess, on property investment? That's an interesting one. Put me on the spot there. I don't see why not, because what you're actually doing is you're financing, you're refinancing money that you've already spent that you haven't borrowed for in the past. That's essentially what externalizing internal borrowing actually is, and so you're just replenishing the cash backing of your reserves, essentially, or working capital surplus. Whether the Treasury would be particularly happy with that, possibly not, but when it comes down to it, that'd be the decision of the local authority. Clearly, by property investment, I'm guessing, given you asked the question, it's property investment that may get you It may remove access from the PWLB. So they have said that you are allowed access to the PWLB if you have to refinance or to externalize internal borrowing if you have assets primarily for yield within your capital program. You just need to make that very clear. And they'll probably just review that decision as part of that process. And that T+5, that extended settlement period, is actually extra time to allow them to review these decisions.
Okay, thanks. So we have 2 more questions, but I think we will come back to these at the end of this webcast. So in the revised PWLB guidance, they also provided some examples, 12 in total. So what I've done is I've just picked out 4, so 2 where it would be allowed and 2 where you wouldn't be allowed to borrow from the PWLB. So starting on the example of regeneration, so it says a council purchases a former office block within its area, and then they provide some context. So the property has been empty for 24 years. The council purchases the private developer that owns the office block, and so the property itself. The developer had previously obtained the planning permission to have it turned into 47 apartments with a small shop, but it is no longer moving forward with these plans. The local authority plans to own the property long term. And yeah, this would be allowed. So the PWLB will support this sort of activity in future. They go on to state whether the council plan to use the former office block or housing, or for new commercial space, because the acquisition and conversion of a derelict building, and I think that's key, is a clear example of regeneration. And then if we just move on to an example of service delivery. So in this example, a council purchases land for an energy generation project. And the context here is the council has made energy efficiency and sustainability a policy priority. The council will purchase land in a neighbouring district for a renewable energy project. Wind farms will be built on the land. The energy generated will be sold back to the national grid, and this income will be used to cross-subsidise the land purchase and other environmental projects. So again, the PWLB would support this sort of activity because the project serves a clear policy purpose for the local authority, advancing its environmental and climate change policies, and it is not primarily to generate an income. So this would be a clear example of service delivery. And then we have 2 examples where you would not be able to borrow from the PWLB to fund these activities. So the first one would be an investment asset bought primarily for yield. And this is to do with a council purchasing a business campus within its local authority area. So the context here is, if we skip to the part about occupancy, so the site has a 98% occupancy with many high-profile tenants and 3,500 workers on site. So the PWLB would not support this kind of activity in future, as a pre-let office building is unlikely to be delivering services, housing or regeneration, and the high occupancy rate of 98% suggests there is not a market failure for this sort of offices in the area. And therefore, because there's no market failure, this would make it an investment asset bought primarily for yield, and the council would be unable to borrow from the PWLB for this purpose. And then finally, so an example of something which isn't service delivery is when a council purchases green bonds. So in the context given, the council has issued a climate emergency declaration as part of a wider agenda to take steps to tackle climate change and become carbon neutral. So they plan to invest in purchase green bonds. So these green bonds will generate an income for the council, and the PWLB would not support this sort of activity, despite their stated environmental objectives, as the green bond will not deliver any direct environmental improvement to the council because there is no new energy generation, so it cannot be categorised as service delivery. However, local authorities may invest in these products as part of its Treasury Management investments. Okay, so that's just a few examples. There are 12 given in the guidance. I'm not going to go through all 12 now. We just simply don't have the time. But I would advise that everyone goes through and reads them if they get a chance. So if we come back to the questions, Nick, so we have one from Anonymous. If you sell a PIFY asset that you have funded with external borrowing and then maintain that borrowing post-sale as part of the general treasury position, could that later be refinanced through the PWLB, or is that borrowing linked to AFY forevermore?
Another Another good question. It's difficult to answer that really without any kind of case study, if you like. We don't know how the Treasury will actually say, you know, how are they going to prove what's what? So I suppose if you applied the capital receipt to your CFR and so essentially paid off the debt, then in that regard, you wouldn't actually have any borrowing, any debt for that particular asset. So maybe if you did apply it, then you know, it would be fine. But we don't know what the Treasury are going to look at when they're actually assessing what's PAPI refinancing or what isn't. So that's a difficult one to answer.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another question from Michael. Thanks for the question. He says, could the sanction of a higher rate potentially apply to all loans, even those for non-yield borrowing?
I don't know. Actually, I must admit, I don't know. It just says it says in the guidance. I think I've got it on screen somewhere. What does it say? After a loan is issued, HM Treasury may also offer the authority a higher interest rate on future PWLB loans. So actually reading that, it might not be the one you've already taken, but it might apply to future loans. And it does say loans, so how many? It could be multiple loans, and it could be for just non-PAPI spending.
Okay, and then we have a question from Pauline. Thanks again for your question. And she asks, is the 10% spend borrowing charge in 1 year or across the 3-year program submitted on Delta?
Another good question. I'm just having a look through the guidance. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find that one. To be safe, I'd probably go on the 3-year, probably, because obviously that's the lower bound. It may be the 1 year that they're really focusing on here. But yeah, I can have a look into the guidance and actually get back to you, Pauline, on that one.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And thanks everyone for your questions. That's all the questions we have right now. So I think it's a good time to draw this to a close. Thank you very much, Nick. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. It's always great. And next week we will have, I believe, my colleagues Greg Reddings and Amar Jandu on a shortened version of Trending Treasury before we return to our 30-minute slots starting in September. However, this one has been 30 minutes despite the despite the 15 minutes we promised at the start. But it's topical and there's a lot to talk about. And I would encourage everyone to read the guidance if they get a chance. So yeah, thank you everyone for listening. Thanks, Nick, again, and see you on next week's Trending Treasury.
Thanks, Barry. Bye, everyone.
Bye.